In the year 4958, the Earth is mostly underwater because of a change in its rotational axis caused by the impact of a huge asteroid in the middle of the 21st century. Most of its inhabitants died in the catastrophe, the only survivors being those living in settlements located over 4,000 meters high over the former sea level, 14 of which are located in the territories of current Asia and 11 located in current South America. In these 3,000 plus years, a new and very advanced civilization has developed, which largely ignores the human development in the planet before that catastrophe. Some scholars began to turn their attention to that culture's legacy after the submarine excavations carried out by several universities in the still populated areas. Today, we will have the extraordinary opportunity to witness, through a holographic projection generated by a strange artifact recently fallen in a small plaza in the Buenos Aires neighborhood known as Caraíto, the Doctoral Thesis Dissertation by Professor Yack Pineda Machaca of La Rinconada University, located in the former Peruvian territory, which presents his in-depth research about 20th and 21st century music, with an error margin of 150 to 250 years.
Dear teaching colleagues, musical archaeological students, graduates, and students of this prestigious house of scholarship. Since my student days, I have felt an enormous curiosity about the pre-cataclysmic cultures, which have been until recently, to a larger degree, unknown to us. Recent underwater excavations have brought to light a great amount of new material, although it is extremely fragmentary, about the customs and habits of our ancestors in all their activities, including our special field, music. This art was completely different from the one nowadays we imagine as music, since it didn't happen in our mind, but was transmitted through the air in the form of oscillations collected by the ears, in the same way as ancient oral communications, nowadays revalued by many educators, among whom I am including myself, and as proven at this very moment, which were then decoded by the brain, producing at that very moment the so-called sonorous perception. Among the fragments of objects related to the so-called musical practice, we had the chance of studying, in close collaboration with outstanding colleagues from other great universities of the inhabited world, such elements as sound records of diverse nature, written records used for the transmission of sound experiences, and even visual records, unfortunately only motionless, of very particular artifacts known apparently as musical instruments, and also other sound objects used in those distant times. I must exceedingly thank at this point the invaluable collaboration of my 6 colleagues who will participate in the presentation of our dissertation. 5 of them will operate some replicas of primitive artifacts, and the 6th one will fulfill an apparently ritual function. We do not discard the religious application of many of these sonorous experiences, which consisted of, according to the recovered visual material, the performance of gestures whose usefulness we have not yet accomplished to understand. Our first example, quite short, is one of the great enigmas that this pre-cataclysmic sonorous practice presents. The piece that we will hear is very different indeed from almost all other reconstructed fragments, and is probably some part of a former cultural stage. It was played apparently in all sonorous events of this kind. We dare to speculate even before the period studied in our thesis, and which has also doubtlessly a ritual content because it was always played at the beginning of the event and has no particular author avowed as its creator. The suggestion of my esteemed colleague, Professor Dr. from the distinguished Korzok University, that this brief sonorous experience does not have an initiation type of content, being merely an adjustment of the artifact's tuning to the room temperature, deserves undoubtedly to be taken into consideration, even though it is not shared by me, because for some reason, the larger artifact imposes on the others its own temperature, which shows a clear power relationship that is not explicable simply by acoustical means. Next, we will explain the operation of each one of these artifacts, which formed a very typical group in that culture, probably of a folkloric origin, although we haven't found any documentation that supports this assertion. We have distinguished, however, three types of artifacts. First, we will introduce those we have named tubes. One of them is built of a primitive metal alloy, and the other one of a natural material coming from the ancient vegetal beings of the planet, which were apparently called reeds. We shall start with the metallic tube, whose name appears in most of the documentary evidence found, unfortunately in a high degree of decomposition, as lute, lauta, lauto, or lute, according to the region of the ancient continents the material came from. For aficionados of pre-cataclysmic archaeology, we recall the reconstructed names of those archaic massifs called, as we have already mentioned, continents. They are as follows: Fricka, Rope, Erica, in some cases almost also mentioned as Merica, which was apparently subdivided into 2 or 3 parts, appearing even in some documents as the name of an individual country, which is very surprising. And finally, Ja and Shiania. This artifact has been found in 3 sizes, which we have denominated in our research as the small one, the medium one, and the big one. This artifact apparently had a main function, which was to generate a series of percussive rhythmical clicks, and a secondary one, which was to let air pass through the tube to produce sounds, mostly of the inharmonic spectrum. For this reason, our hypothesis is that the first to be built was the small one, followed by the medium one, and finally the big one, basically in this order to make the clicks louder, since we have verified that for a long time these artifacts had been played without being amplified by electricity. The secondary function of this artifact, in its 3 sizes, was achieved, as we have been able to check the fragmentary visual records recovered, by placing the lips of the player on the small orifice of the artifact, which was not covered by a key, to produce, by passing the air generated by the player's breathing through the tube, producing the most diverse sounds, as already noted, mostly of the inharmonic spectrum. Next, we will listen to some of these possibilities. The first of them probably emerged as a complement to that basic function, It consisted of producing the clicking sounds just demonstrated, but while blowing simultaneously into the tube. Later, the possibilities of using the air will be explored, although always with extremely rudimentary results, which is obviously a consequence of the lack of knowledge about the functioning of these artifacts, as we will detail later by stating our working hypothesis. Typical tribal sounds invoke, without a doubt, some kind of deity present in the consciousness of those people who populated our planet before the great catastrophe. In a more evolved stage, they managed to sustain the sound, even though this would still have been very fragile because of the inharmonic partials that would have emerged from a still very imperfect emission technique. This clearly shows the lack of control over the unknown artifact that still prevailed at that time. Surely, after several generations of exploration, they finally would have managed to discover the way to emit the harmonic spectrum sounds for which the artifact was probably originally built. The other type of these tubes, black-colored, was available in two sizes. The small one and the big one. Its name seems to be Clarinet, Clarinette, or Clarinet, according to its geographic provenance. In this case, our hypothesis is that the big one was created first, since it is somehow mixed with the metallic tubes. And the small one later, since it was already purely built of the material of vegetal origin. The basic functions of these artifacts are the same as those exposed before, that is, the production of clicks with the keys. Later, they would discover in it the already mentioned secondary function, that is the passing of the air through the tube by the player's breathing, also in diverse modes. However, the learning process will clearly show the precariousness of their initial technique as they explored this unknown artifact, since they will have used the tongue and will even have bitten the vibrating sheet of vegetal material that produces the sound before they could find a way to emit the artifact's proper harmonic spectra. That form another group totally different from the previous one, which we have called resonant cases. Also built with the material of vegetal provenance already mentioned, on them are 4 wires of a synthetic material that are tightened, which will be a very important sonorous element in these artifacts, but not the only one. The cases fulfill the function of amplifying the sound generated by the cables, although in many instances the cases themselves will generate the oscillations, as we will display in some of our examples. In this group, we find the minor size case, which we have called within our research mini case. We have found the denomination Violine, Violin, Violino, and even the extremely strange word Eige for the smaller sized instrument. And the larger one, which we have called mega case, we have only found for this one in documentary fragments the incomprehensible denomination VC point, about which we have absolutely no reference to its meaning. Since both artifacts clearly are similar in their construction, we will jointly present the different sound possibilities that we have found documented in our research. The mega case presents similar modalities as the mini case, but the posture of the player is different. She must necessarily play sitting, fixing on the floor a piercing element that avoids the slipping of the artifact, and which also surely had personal defense purposes in the case of questionable performances. Next, we will demonstrate a parallel procedure to that of the keys in the recently presented tubes, which consists in tapping with the fingers on the resonant case, surely as a continuum of performance practice derived from another kind of artifact of their own culture, today unknown to us, which would be played in a similar way. Usual element in the performance of the cases is this strange gadget, which consists of a rod made of vegetal material and a bundle of tightened fibers stemming from the hairiness of some pre-cataclysmic animal, whose characteristics will be surely examined in the field of paleozoology. The name of this strange implement is extremely in doubt, since we have found such diverse denominations as rko and rche, these two are undoubtedly related, and o, or organ. These perhaps came from other regional dialects. At some point, individuals began to use this element, although it may be proven that it must have taken a long time to find the way to generate a relatively involved sound by placing the element on the most appropriate place, and only after many failed trial and error attempts, as we will see next. Yet surely after a time of exploration of these artifacts, they would have arrived at the most appropriate way to extract sound from them. As it so happens, Professor Vishal Hain, assistant professor to the distinguished colleague Dr. Sanjay Deshpande from the prestigious Korsok University, has listed in his own investigations the supposed existence of a middle-sized artifact between the mini case and the mega case, and even another enormous one, larger than the last, although we don't have any certain data to confirm this assertion. Finally, we arrive at the most complex, but always, of course, within the limitations of this culture, and enigmatic of the documented musical artifacts, which undoubtedly had a dominant role in the previous rituals, as we have already seen, by imposing its own temperature on the rest, surely because of its size, which would have probably had a symbolic content as well. Our hypothesis is that it was created after the others, and that when joining the group, for reasons that we can hardly understand, it began rapidly to dominate it. Its generic denomination was Iano, while it is also documented by the name Lavir. But we are not quite sure if it is the same artifact, the latter being perhaps a modification or a variant of the former. This artifact astonishes us because of its relative complexity within a culture in other senses so primitive. Although in our hypothesis, which we will delineate later, it is an artifact coming from an earlier cultural layer with respect to the records studied in our research. According to the average of the numerous fragments found outside of this folkloric configuration, and as an individual artifact, we conclude that its most important components are the numerous tightened cables which lie inside the vegetal material receptacle. These are made of a pure metallic alloy. The number of elements used to generate vibrations on them is amazing, among which we can mention sticks of diverse types, fibers similar to those used in the resonant cases, little spheres made of a material called lass, metal rods, small plectra made of diverse materials, and of course, the fingers and nails of the player. Next, we will show the use of some of these elements, which undoubtedly were manufactured as basic accessories for the usual performance on this curious artifact. All these elements were applied inside this large artifact, which was undoubtedly its main performance area, as stated in most of the recovered documents. Such elements as the little last spheres laid on the cables are a basic accessory of this artifact. These are frequently combined with a violent foot strike on one of the metallic pieces located in the lower part of it, whose function was to set the cable's resonance free. the uden, the probable name of this vegetal material, the uden lid, which covers the strange gadgets seen in the initial ritual, likely remained closed for a long time, which could be explained by its percussive function, which was clearly the purpose of its presence in the artifact. One of the great enigmas about this huge sonorous artifact is the presence of the rod set and their strange arrangement in white and black rows, respectively. Now, these were very rarely used, except in the initial ritual, which we have already witnessed, in which seemingly the essential performance elements of this artifact were never used. As has always happened throughout the history of mankind, at some point, one individual, more curious than his contemporaries, decided to lift this lid, finding the rods, without knowing what to do with it. He likely tried to produce sounds in the same way he did inside the artifact. Until one day, perhaps by chance, he managed to operate one rod, discovering the connection with the interior of the huge artifact. That moment most probably generated the ritual of temperature adjustment that we have witnessed previously. A brand new world opened up before their eyes and ears when they discovered that the Titan cables of this artifact could also be operated indirectly through the white and black rods, achieving results unthinkable for them until that moment. After a period of time that we cannot determine precisely, they would also have realized that by removing the elements laid inside the artifact, they could get a sound less perturbed in its resonance. We will now hear a fragment of a typical piece from the period of our subject, which is the late 20th to 21st century according to the pre-cataclysmic chronology, always with an error range of 150 to 250 years. It is evident in the following example that it is nearly impossible for the players to extract sound from the artifacts, which confirms our hypothesis that those were, even in this evolutionary stage, still strongly alien to their culture. Or, as our thesis proposes, to a completely different culture. These sonorous implements belonging to one culture, while the more complex artifacts were the product of another more developed cultural era, which were likely found by these individuals after another natural catastrophe. The sonorous experience, called by them music, was carried out in a stage previous to the discovery of these artifacts, seemingly through these objects, which produced mostly inharmonic sound spectra and which probably served ritual purposes at a much earlier stage than the sonorous ritual presented at the beginning of our dissertation. Next, we will introduce some of the many sound objects found. Paradoxically, they were extracted from the excavation layers higher than those containing the fragments of the enormously more complex sonorous artifacts we have already seen, which poses a new enigma to the archaeologists of our time. We will now briefly explain the use of each of them. And not having a complete certainty about their original names, we suspect that some of them had a completely different purpose to this purely sonorous one. We have designated them in our work as evidence number 1, number 2, number 3, and so on. We also have the impression that these objects were not necessarily played by a specialist, who was seemingly necessary for the much more evolved artifacts introduced previously, but that any musician from that culture in some way could manage to perform with them, which results in further evidence of their precedence with respect to the artifacts, whose complexity supposed a technical specialization for their correct performance. We have classified the recovered objects according to their modality of sound emission as blown objects, evidences number 1, number 2, and 3, rubbed objects, whether against each other or with the accessory of the resonant cases, evidences 4, 5, and 6, squeezed objects, evidences 7 and 9, and pulled objects, evidence 8. Evidence 1. Evidence 2. Evidence number 3. Evidence number 4. And number 5. Evidence number 6. Evidence number 7. Evidence number 8. And evidence number 9. Next, we will hear the reconstruction of a short fragment of a work written by an unidentified composer from the studied period, who came from one of the ancient countries into which the continent called Rup was subdivided. The few idiomatic clues on the score give as his or her possible origin the ancient neighboring territories of Tully and Whedon, in which these sound objects were frequently used. In a later evolutionary stage of this culture, we also encountered musical fragments that brought together some of these primitive sound objects with the much more sophisticated artifacts introduced previously. These were probably found abandoned by the vanished culture to which they originally belonged and were then adopted by the new one, which until that moment had only possessed the primitive sound gadgets. A fact that strongly supports this line of thinking is that in these cited fragments, the performance of the more complex artifacts is extremely primitive, meaning, in our opinion, that they would correspond to the very earliest moment of the discovery of the artifacts, unknown to them, which belonged to a much more developed culture that had disappeared long ago by then. Certainly, they were trying to reproduce with the more sophisticated artifacts, which were alien to their culture, the primitive sonorities produced by their own ancient sound objects. We will even find some passages in which both groups of objects intermingle within the same musical piece, which may be best defined, again, as a mere sonorous experience. Later stage, although once again it was paradoxically found located in much deeper layers than the previous ones, perhaps because of a landslide, shows us much more development of the artifact's performance techniques, as if the players had already deeply studied the techniques by which they could finally get the sound emission for which the artifacts were originally built, achieving in this way unimaginable results compared to the previous examples. The composer of this fragment, whose name regrettably has not been preserved, came from an ancient city in the upper part of the American, also American from other sources, continent called Los Angeles, whose name makes us suppose that it was founded millennia earlier by Friccan colonizers, that is to say, from the continent Fricka. In spite of his American origin, this composer writes some instructions on the score, such as Eicht geweikt, or Eicht, in a language that maybe was spoken in other areas of the continent, since it doesn't correspond either to the language found in literary sources or with the musical documentation from this area, probably known as California. Fragments have been found, although only as sound and not as written records. They don't fit in any way the logic of the timeline proposed in our thesis. They are by now another great enigma for us as well as for most of our colleagues. The short example that follows seems to come from the same period, according to the stratum in which it was found, although it has nothing in common with any other evidence found. Its geographic provenance is doubtful. Some scholars suggest an area in ancient Erica or America, while others are inclined toward ancient Fricka, while we otherwise lean toward the northern limit of the ancient populated surface near the old magnetic pole, because we think that only in an area of extreme cold could a music of these characteristics develop, a music really suitable to warming up both the audience and the players. Other fragments unearthed, unfortunately very short, were created in a musical style somehow related to this previous one, although because of their extreme brevity, it is virtually impossible for us to identify their origin, let alone their temporary dating, although they were located in common strata with the other reconstructed fragments. Having arrived at this point in our dissertation, we will pose our working hypothesis in summary form for those listeners who did not have the opportunity to read the preliminary articles about our work, published in our university's telepathic magazine, Music in the Mind. We will then move on to our postulates and final conclusions. Number one, a pre-cataclysmic population from the mid-20th century, according to the pre-cataclysmic chronology, always with an era range of 150 to 250 years, had a very developed auditory life, since they had large auditoriums for the performance of sound events with perfectly planned acoustics and constant room temperature systems, providing great comfort to the audiences of such events. As well, relatively sophisticated sound and image recording artifacts, although this population was very primitive with regards to the sonorous elements they used to produce the acoustic experiences that they called music. Number two, at some point in their history, the individuals of this culture, which were disseminated throughout all the ancient surface of our planet, came upon musical artifacts from a much earlier culture. These were totally ignored, and without knowing how to decipher the ancient writings they found together with them, began to extract sounds from these artifacts in a very rudimentary fashion, combining them additionally with the objects from their own sonic tradition. Number three, over time, they developed more and more a performance technique that resembled the one used by the culture which originally generated the artifacts. They began also to build, after encountering the original devices, increasingly perfect copies of those ancient sound artifacts, achieving remarkable results. Number four, on the other hand, other discovered sound documents, which seem to be contemporaneous with the ones previously mentioned according to their stratigraphy, although they have practically nothing in common with the development of the other so-called music, constitute in themselves a sizable enigma to be resolved in future investigations. At this point, we must here express our dissent, with all due respect, from the opinions of our distinguished colleague, Dr. Chun Hei, from the prestigious University of Wenquan, who, after her own investigations, came to completely opposite conclusions from ours, lining up the same fragments recovered out of the same strata, but in a chronologically inverse sequence. To demonstrate in a practical, and in our opinion, an irrefutable way the correctness of our thesis, we will now listen to an extract of 4 selected sound fragments from our dissertation. First, chronologically ordered according to Dr. Chun Hei's theory, and then sequenced according to our own conclusions, which constitutes the central core of our thesis. For my distinguished colleague, The fragments would be lined up as follows. Example 1, please. Example 2. Example 3. And example 4. Next, in our view, the correct historical sequence. Example 1. Example 2. Example 3. And example 4. To conclude our dissertation, we will listen to one last fragment that comes from rather a strange composer who, I confess, is not even very interesting, but from whom we possess the most comprehensive fragment recovered during the recent submarine excavations. Consequently, we could not set it aside in our research. The geographic provenance of the composer is doubtful, since the titles of his works, mostly incomplete in their reconstruction, are written in different pre-cataclysmic languages. Furthermore, we cannot square him with any of the most common stylistic lines of his time, which anyway are not identified with any real surety. In some of the rescued fragments of his work, the musicians must play excerpts from works by other composers. In some cases, the players must even perform an oral narration while playing his or her artifact. Therefore, we must consider him a pioneer in the way he questions some things totally unthinkable in our current time, such as intellectual property. Moreover, he is probably a creator with very few ideas of his own. We will listen to a fragment of a piece whose title has not survived due to the prevailing humidity in the location of its finding, and because of which the first page of the score is partially blurred, although we have been able to rescue the name of its author, which is Miguel Bellusci. With this example, we conclude our thesis dissertation, and we make ourselves available to the distinguished jury that will evaluate our work in the mandatory telepathic colloquium. For those people interested in reviewing our full work, a holographic copy of it will be delivered tomorrow to the new multimedia center of our music department, which is located, for those who don't know it yet, hovering by an anti-gravitational system on level 2, over the facilities dedicated to the time travels of the physics department, which I assume everyone knows. To the attending audience, to my dear colleagues who have collaborated in this dissertation, to the professors and students of our dear university, I thank you most sincerely for your presence and attention.